how much bacteria do we get on the produce itself that's getting into the system versus giving food for what we already have?
Yeah, unfortunately, our food is relatively dead now. It used to be that we got huge number of organisms in with our food, right? We consumed non-sterilized food for the most part. And then, of course, we started preserving food by fermenting it. And then you're getting lots of microbial exposure to the fermented versions of the food. And so our ancestors would eat things with dirt on it. And we just don't do that anymore. Know that in the US, when most produce and vegetables and all that are harvested, they all are put through a chlorine wash, right? And so they're sterilized to a certain degree. Now, the level of chlorine is not going to sterilize the food, but you're knocking down the microbes quite a bit. So we rarely get any sort of beneficial microbes on our produce. This is why it's also important, if people can, to try to grow some of their own food if possible, right? Having a garden, and not everyone's going to become a farmer and start growing all their needs. But let's say you've got a tomato garden, or you've got tomatoes and cucumbers. Maybe you've got tomatoes, cucumbers, and one other thing that you're growing. Even just adding those, and you're using good, clean soil, I would caution people against going to your hardware store and buying a bag of soil, right? Because some of that soil is treated quite a bit with lots of chemicals and all that to add growth factors and all that. What I would actually do is utilize any soil that you have access to. In our case, when we built a garden at my house, we just used the soil that was there on the dirt underneath the grass. The problem is we actually went as far as looking at it under a microscope, and we saw that the soil was virtually dead. Right? There's like no microbes in that soil. And of course, not surprising, because people have been using glyphosate and all these pesticides and herbicides and all that on the ground for decades now. So those things tend to sterilize the environment. So what we did is we actually got some fermented peat moss, and we got some rock dust. So you can go to the quarry, a local quarry, and get some rock dust. And just raw rock dust just from the quarry itself. And then we actually went out on hikes and just grabbed soil from the natural environments, right? Around the trees and where there's a lot of vegetation and shrubbery and all that, that soil is teeming with microbes. And then we got that, I mentioned the fermented peat moss. So those few things that we added and brought to our soil and mixed it in, brought life back to the soil. Right. So that adds microbes to the environment and adds it to it. Now, we use spores as well, because we were using in our factory in India, when we were manufacturing the spores, we were actually taking the ferment. Once we isolated the spores, we were taking the ferment from the spores, and we were spreading it all over the area around the factory where we had a green space, and it looked like a rainforest, because it was such great food for the soil and for the microbes. So I started doing the same thing. I started fermenting with spores at home, and then pouring the ferment into the soil as well. So we had an amazing garden at my previous house. We haven't built one here yet, which we just moved to. We had an amazing garden that looked like a rainforest, right? And we were getting cucumbers, jalapenos, tomatoes. I think we got carrots out of it. And a number of things. Now, when you eat that kind of food and the soil is healthy, clean, doesn't have chemicals, you've brought life to the soil, you can eat that stuff without sterilizing it, right? We would pluck the cucumbers and maybe rinse it off a little bit with just regular water, and then cut it up and eat it. You add that to your diet, you're bringing in living food into the diet. Maybe 60%, 70% of what you're eating came from the grocery store, which is fine. You're at least bringing in living food to add to it.
You mentioned this chlorine bath that our produce at the grocery store is getting. Do you know if that's on organic as well?
It likely is to a certain degree, yeah. Because I think that is more of a food safety issue. Believe it or not, produce is a bigger source of E. coli infection than protein is, right? The most common is things like lettuce, and cabbage and so on. And in fact, tomatoes are a big source of it. So Campylobacter, E. coli, and all that. So, and part of that is because our soil is so unhealthy and contaminated. This runoff from this factory farm next door where the animals are being hit with antibiotics, right? And because they're hit with antibiotics so much, their pathogen loads tend to be really high because their microbiomes are all off, right? And that provides the opportunity for the pathogens to go. So the amount of E. coli that our cows shed, the amount of salmonella that our chickens shed are way more than what the natural grazing versions of those animals would, right? And so that runoff and all that also contaminates the soil. And I used to work in food safety as a microbiologist, and we would do experiments where you plant tomatoes with salmonella contaminated in the soil. The salmonella will actually end up going through the roots and into the tomato. So you could have a tomato now that looks perfectly clean. You could even clean the outside, but you bite into it or you cut into it, you've got salmonella on the inside of it, right? So that is a big danger in the food industry, in the industrial complex that we have for the food system. So they chlorine wash everything as part of the food safety protocol.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
Adding spores to a gut microbiome in 3 weeks increased the diversity of the gut microbiome by almost 25 to 30%. And it increased the growth of keystone species, and it brought down pathogens. So the spores are like the police or the orchestrator.